I'm Phyllis Stiles with Bee City USA. I'm the founder. We started in Asheville, North Carolina, and now we're spread across the country and into Canada. And I want to tell you how this very, very practical person essentially leapt off a cliff a few years ago and became a buzzaholic. One buzz, I was hooked, and now I just can't get enough buzzes. So I find myself doing silly things like wearing antenna these days. I never thought I would do anything like this. And in 2015, not far from here, I found myself on the roof of the Department of the Interior receiving the National Award for Pollinator Advocate of the Year. Thank you. If you look at that picture there, that was the result of a single bee sting. And the reason that I want to show you that is because the reason I'm standing here today is because my husband begged me to become a beekeeper with him after colony collapse disorder became headline news. And I said, but bees sting. And he convinced me, and I went to bee school and I got a bee. In 2007, after colony collapse disorder was in the headlines, we saw headlines like these everywhere. It was all over the media. The honeybees were in trouble, they were dying, and they really did us a huge service by getting our attention. They needed to get our attention, and so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. There was a beautiful movie called Vanishing of the Bees in 2009 that told the story really well. And then in 2013, it was still headline news as Time magazine explored what's happening to the bees and the prospect of a world without bees. Last year, 44% of American bee colonies died on average. And the really, truly startling part of that statistic is that just as many bees died in the summer as in the winter. Beekeepers used to be concerned every winter to see how many of their hives had survived the winter. Now we're just equally as concerned about them surviving the rest of the year. So people are asking the question, is the honeybee the canary in the coal mine? What is the honeybee warning us of? I want you to see some other bees because the honeybee is telling us an important message that has to do with all pollinators, not just honeybees that the colonists brought from Europe in the 1600s. These are beautiful native sweat bees. There's two kinds of sweat bees there, and there's one small bee that I haven't identified, but these are what real pollinators look like. And we have 3,600 species of bees that are native to the United States. There are 7 species of honeybees in the world, and we've come to rely on them for our agricultural systems. And then we have wannabes. I want to show you some research that's being done at Harvard and in Japan with robot drone bees. This is going to be fast, so watch. Not much like those real bees we just saw. And then in greenhouses, for a while now, we've been bringing in bumblebees, colonies of bumblebees to pollinate our tomatoes because tomatoes require sonication for pollination, and honeybees can't do that, and in fact, honeybees will fly up to the sun and kill themselves on the ceilings of greenhouses. So bumblebees are the ideal pollinators for tomatoes. But if you don't have bumblebees, there's this handy-dandy mater baiter. It's a vibrator, and they can actually vibrate at the right frequency and cause that flower to release its pollen. And it takes about a minute per flower, and it's not unusual for greenhouses to have as many as 5,000 tomato plants. So imagine how labor-intensive it is to have humans pollinating tomato flowers. So what's killing our honeybees? Well, it's a complicated question, and poor nutrition is certainly a factor, and that's both in the quantity of the food that they're getting and the quality of the food that they're getting. And that's attributed to partly habitat loss. We are growing and we're developing our landscape in ways that are convenient for us, but not convenient for the honeybees and other pollinators. And we're also taking up more and more fields with industrial agriculture that's really basically a food desert for a bee, because it's just a massive, massive area of just one crop that blooms very shortly, and then there's nothing left for the pollinators after that. So that's also a contributor. And then the pesticides, it's estimated that Americans use 3.5 pounds of pesticides on average per person each year. And that includes insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides. So that causes problems for pollinators. And much of it is being used prophylactically. It's not that they're addressing a problem that exists, they're trying to prevent a problem. And that's very harmful to all kinds of beneficial insects, including pollinators. And then we have parasites. In 1987, we finally got the parasite, the Varroa Destructor mite, that was common in Asian bees, but we didn't have them in European honeybees like we have. And our honeybees were not adapted to them, and they are wreaking havoc. And what's even worse is they're vectors for diseases. So it's not bad enough that the honeybees are suffering with these critters that live on them and suck their fat bodies their whole lives from the time that they're larvae until they're adult bees, but they're also passing viruses to the bees. And it really diminishes their immune systems. And then we have climate change. It's just kind of a wild card in the whole mix that disturbs all kinds of things. That's a much longer conversation. So you put all that together, and the better question would be, what's not killing the honeybees? Their poor little immune systems are just so compromised. They've taken about all they can take. The UN had a task force for the past couple of years of over 90 scientists around the world that was charged with coming up with a set of policy recommendations for governments around the world on how they could protect their pollinators. And in that task force, they reported that 40% of pollinator species around the world are at risk. Let's talk about the other pollinators. We have our beautiful beetles, considered the oldest pollinator on Earth. We have all kinds of other bees, 20,000 species of bees. That's a gorgeous leafcutter bee carrying her pollen under her abdomen. And that's a syrphid fly. There's a whole slew of flower flies that are very important pollinators. And then the famous monarch butterfly, representing all of the butterflies in the world, also important pollinators. And hummingbirds, they're all in our hemisphere. There's about 300 species, and many of them have tongues just as long as their bodies, and the flowers have evolved just to attract a hummingbird. Then we have the bats. While bats are not important pollinators in the eastern United States, they're very important pollinators out west and in the tropics. And every time you have a glass of tequila, you can thank the bats. That bat is actually not yellow, it's covered in pollen. And lastly, the moths. That's another big group of pollinators. Most of them are nocturnal like the bats, but some are daytime feeders. And the flowers have evolved to open just at night to attract that kind of a pollinator, either a bat or a moth. So what would we lose without the pollinators? Well, 90% of the world's wild plant species depend on a pollinator. They can't reproduce without the help of a pollinator, 90%. And just think about all of the other species that depend on those 90% of our plant species in the world. So we're talking about a cascading failure of our systems to support lots and lots of species without our pollinators. 1 in 3 bites of food that we eat depends on a pollinator. So the thing that the UN report reported on was how important those bites are to supplying our micronutrient needs and our antioxidants. And so there were implications for the health of people around the world if we don't have those foods available to us anymore. Whole Foods did a great service by going through this exercise in one of their markets in New Jersey, and they pulled out all of the produce that depended on pollinators. It turned out to be 52%, and so you can see the before and after picture there. But it's not just produce. Just think about it. Our cows eat alfalfa and clover can't seed without the help of pollinators. So even our dairy aisle will be impacted without the pollinators. And we'd also lose the great monarch migration, as much as 3,000 miles that the monarch travels from Canada to Mexico to overwinter. Well, we just couldn't stand all that bad news. We're optimists, so we started Bee City USA and Bee Campus USA to bring this cause home to people's backyards and their front yards across America and to their cities and their campuses. It's very, very easy to point your finger at the big ag companies and the pesticide companies and the lawn care companies and even commercial beekeepers and blame them for the problems with what's going on with all the pollinators. But we say, let's just start right here. What can I do? What can I do in my own little world that I control? How can I help turn this thing around and reverse this decline? We live by the Margaret Mead quote. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And so that's what we're trying to do, is mobilize small groups of committed people. And so in Asheville, North Carolina, they were our first Bee City USA. This is a school group at Claxton Elementary. Just a couple of days ago, they had Bee Day, and they did it upright. They wore black and yellow. They made queen crowns. They looked at the bees in the observation hive. The fifth graders taught the first graders. They planted habitat. And we're just seeing this multiplied in school after school, city after city, across the places that have become bee cities. Here's Decatur, Georgia. They had fun with that and called it Beecatur. That's another bee city. And then just yesterday, Mayor Bowser in Washington, D.C. was out passing out these seed packets at all the metro stations. They passed out 9,000 seed packets of pollinator seeds in 90 minutes to make Washington, D.C. more pollinator friendly. And our second city was Talent, Oregon, and we have to thank them. For 2 years, we waited for our second city after we started in 2012. And once Talent, Oregon, 3,000 people decided to become a bee city, the floodgates just kind of opened. So these are all the cities we have today. We're up to 44, and it just keeps growing and growing. Our largest ones are Washington and Seattle and San Francisco and Albuquerque, and then lots of little cities all over the country. And they have to make commitments. They have to annually renew each year. Just the goal is to become more PC, pollinator conscious. And we have a Bee Campus program, and that's growing. We're up to 24 campuses across the country, all academic institutions, and they engage service learning and coursework in addition to all the things that the cities are doing. So wake up, let's get buzzy. This is what we need to do. Just plant lots more native plants, lots of diversity, so something's blooming in each season. Use pesticides very judiciously, if at all. Let your lawn get a little bit messy. Leave natural areas for the ground nesters and the cavity nesters. And remove invasive exotic plants to make room for the native plants. Tell your friends about pollinators and support your local native plant nurseries. These are just to get started. I want to close with this inspiring video of Miles. Hi, Miles.
Hi.
So tell me about you and the bees.
I like bees.
What do you like best about the bees?
When I see them having the flowers.
Oh, they love those flowers, don't they?
Yeah.
Can I see your bee knuckles? Oh, what are the bees gonna eat? Flowers. All right. Thank you for loving the bees, Miles.
You're welcome.
Have a fun weekend.